Hello everyone, it's John Wheatcroft here again, bringing you Sunday Q&A number 15. 15, wow, time flies, eh? Once again, this is going to be recorded in advance, so I'm doing this Sunday morning because I've been invited in this afternoon to record a radio show with my friend Asa Murphy, so it means I'm not going to be around this evening. So I hope that you'll excuse me recording this in advance one more time. Thanks once again for some great questions. We've got some really interesting topics to look at today. We're going to look at some chord substitution. We're going to look at some chord melody ideas that kind of interrelated really. And we're also going to give you analysis of a lick, a famous Biréli Lagrène phrase or a phrase that he uses. And we're going to look at how you can use similar kind of ideas in your own playing. But as usual, we're going to start with a piece. And I promised you a little bit of Django. So I'm going to begin by playing my take on Django's Improvisation number 2. I hope you liked that. That was Django's Improvisation number 2. Even though it's called an improvisation, it's fairly likely that that was a piece, like a composed piece. He recorded 2 takes of it, and I think he used to play it live as well, if I'm not mistaken. I think there might even be some recordings. I'd have to check that out. I generally play it as a kind of little etude solo thing live. And what's interesting is, of course, as we're not gigging so frequently as we would usually be, I had to practice that this week and make certain that I remembered the details and some of the little corners and so on. And it's amazing if you're not using something regularly, how some of the sort of the focus can cloud a little bit in certain areas, and then questioning fingerings and having to go back and even listen to the originals to remind myself of certain parts, even though I've played this tune live dozens and dozens of times. So the reason why I mention this is it ties in with something that I've said many times on these sessions, and that is I'm doing them mainly so that it gives my practice some focus. Secondly, you know, it's good hopefully to share ideas. It's good for it's good for me, and hopefully, you know, you guys are learning something from it too. But principally, it polarizes my practice because it tells me what I need to work on, or certainly some things that I need to work on, because I don't want to play on these Sunday things and it not sound good. So this week I've been revisiting not only this Django piece, but also some of the topics that we're going to cover based upon your questions, and that's where we'll move on to next. So Tony sent me a great question, as he always does, relating to chord substitutions, some of the common chord substitutions. And at this point, I'd like to mention an amazing video that I watched when I was probably about 20, maybe a bit younger even. Joe Pass brought out this immense resource just within an hour session, you know, called, I think it was called Solo Jazz Guitar. And he's there playing his Ibanez, Joe Pass, just him and the guitar, nothing else. And he starts by playing a 1-6-2-5 in the key of C, which is C major, A minor, D minor, G7, or some form of G7. And then he substitutes or makes variations. I have to be careful about the word substitute. He creates variations on that for maybe 25 minutes, you know, going through all different permutations. And what's interesting, once again, you know, I rebought that. It's out on DVD now. You can buy it for like a tenner or something. It's really cheap. I think I was doing some research for a Guitar Techniques magazine article I may have written about him at some stage, and I thought, I want to see that video again. So I've got it on VHS tape somewhere, but no video player, you know, so I had to buy it on DVD, as we do. And reminded myself of just how great it was, but also how much of it had stuck. So going back to that, the first point of me having to relearn Django's Improvisation number 2, even though I've played it loads of times, there are certain things that just stick, you know. So I noticed that almost every chord voicing that he played is now part of my vocabulary. It's like, you know, from me being sort of a late teenager, 20-year-old sort of enthusiastic, sort of voracious practicer, which has not really changed, to be honest, but really methodically going through that video. In fact, if I remember rightly, somewhere in the world exists, you know, a manuscript pad where I wrote down every chord voicing, because even though they come on the screen, I found that when I was not looking at it, I couldn't remember them, so I wrote them down, and then now I just play them now they've been committed to my memory. Just about how effective that was. So the first point of this to everyone is go and find that video, you know, for what it costs, it's worth its weight in gold, you know. So some of the things that I'm going to say here are, you know, I make no apology for lifting them directly from Joe Pass, you know, but I think it's good to attribute where some of these ideas come from. And again, you know, I'm pretty certain he didn't invent them. You know, this stuff is out there, like the rules of grammar, you know. He's just was immensely fluent with these ideas and could sort of apply them in real time, rather than this being like sort of a series of like pre-prepared licks. Although I'm sure they exist as well. You know, like you'll have like little couplings of chords where this chord leads to this chord leads to this chord, and that's learned much the same way as you might learn a lick or whatever. The thing about it is, if you've got that many of them, then you can start connecting them up in different ways, so it feels much more fluid and it feels more improvised and so on. But anyway, so just to begin, I'm going to maybe mention some of the points that Joe Pass raises. I'll approach it in a slightly different way, so there's validity in looking at both. So I'll try not to directly imitate what he does, but I'll show you some of the principles that he mentions. Okay. So the first thing is that you can turn various chords that wouldn't otherwise be into dominant sevenths. Right. So, and the reason why this works is when chords move in fourths, so meaning like a G going to a C or an A going to a D, the first of those two chords can serve as the dominant of the second. So meaning, if I'm on a C chord, I'm just going to do this with the harmonized major scale. So there's C major, then we have D minor, of course, we have E minor, we have F major, G7, A minor. Now B half diminished in and of itself is actually kind of like an inversion of G7. That's what that is. It's like a G7 with a B in the bass, or G9 with a B in the bass. So this serves as a dominant chord in and of itself. So when you play this, that's really like going Boom, dum. So 5-1. Okay, so that 5-1 move can be introduced before each of the other events. So meaning, if I want to go from C to D, the most direct route is to go straight from C to D. But if I want to make the journey a little bit more interesting, I can go from C via the 5 chord of the next event, not where we are, where we're going. So if I'm on C and I'm going to ask myself what's the next chord going to be, it depends where we're going to land, and we're going to land on D minor. So I could go C, A7, because A7 is the dominant chord of D minor, and I say we were going to E minor. What's the dominant chord of E minor? Well, we ask ourselves, what's the 5 of E? B. B7 to E. So instead of my progression being C, D minor, E minor, it can now become C, A7, D minor, B7, E minor, C7, F, D7, G, E7, A minor, B half diminished, which is G7, back to C. Okay, so there's a dominant chord there placed in front of all of the events that you would find in the harmonized C major scale. I hope that makes sense. So just one more time. C, A7, D minor, B7, E minor, C7, F, G7, D7, G7, E7, A minor. So C, A7 is the 5 of D, B7 is the 5 of E, C7 is the 5 of F, D7 is the 5 of G, E7 is the 5 of A, and then B half diminished is the 5 of, because it's actually G7. Hope that makes sense. G7. Okay. Now, a few weeks ago we talked about diminished connections, of how diminished chords and dominant sevenths are actually related. So, for example, here's A7. Here's B flat diminished. Same thing, yeah. Or A7 flat 9. Or D flat diminished, in actual fact. It looks like D flat diminished, doesn't it? Okay. So what I can do is, instead of going major to dominant to minor to dominant to minor to dominant, I can actually go major, diminished. See what I was doing there? So instead of going to A7, I play like in its first inversion, but I put a flat 9 in, and it resembles a diminished chord. So sometimes what you might see as a chord substitution is not actually a chord substitution at all. What it is it's a reinterpretation of the same notes, but you're seeing from a different perspective. It makes you think it's something else. Okay. And that's one of the things that Joe Pass uses. So for example, he takes his 1, 6, 2, 5. And one of the first things you can do is, because we've got some fourth motion there, A goes to D, D goes to G, G goes to C, is that they can become dominant, like what we just did. Yeah. So instead of going C to A minor, I can go C to A7. And if I wanted to, I could go D7, G7. If I felt like it, you can leave. So now, because that's the case, I could go C to C sharp diminished to D minor to B diminished back to C. So we think we're doing something different there because these diminished chords are coming in. But they're actually the same chords reinterpreted. So it could be C, A7, D7, G7, or I could go C, C sharp diminished, which is A7 to D minor to D D diminished, which is G7 and so on. So you might think, oh, there's a super chord substitution being used there, but in actual fact, it's just the same chords that were there previously, just respelled, so that we see them as a different event, when in actual fact, it's the exact same thing. Okay, so with this in mind, that's one common chord substitution, is whenever a chord resolves in fourths, it can become a dominant chord. That's one thing that you can do. So you could go C, A7, D7, G7 if you like. Okay, so that's the secondary dominant rule, if you like. Okay, so here's another one of those reinterpretations that Joe Pass does, which isn't really a substitution, right? So these are what I'm going to call sort of implied subs. They're not really a substitution. A substitution is when you replace things with something completely different, or where most aspects of it are different. This would be kind of akin to saying, you know, you're going to buy a new Strat or whatever, and you take it into the shop and they just paint it a different color and give you it back. You know, you'd spot that it's actually the same thing, but just modified. You know, but sometimes it's put across and we perceive it like it's a different thing, and that can have its uses, because if you perceive it like it's something else, then you might treat it like a different thing and play new ideas. So going along with the deception is actually sometimes useful to us, right? So one of the principal ones is this. So a rule Joe Pass talks about is where we go 1, 6, and I'll play as a dominant chord, and I'll keep the 2 chord as a minor chord, 5, then we replace the 1 chord with a 3. So instead of going 1, 6, 2, 5, 3, 6, 2, 5. And that 3 chord could either be a minor chord. It sets up like a 2, 5, 2, 5, 1. I call this Charlie Parker line. Kind of stuff. Okay, now that feels like we've done something different there, but in actual fact, the 3 is the 1. So when we look at our C major 7, what we see there is an E minor over C. So that's not really a substitute at all. So you could even do that when it's not being substituted. So I could play E minor over C major 7. In fact, I just did, you know. Or I could play C major over E minor 7. Like when I applied this, I went. That was a C major. Those kind of ideas. So me going 1, 6, 6, 2, 5, 3 isn't really a substitute at all. It's just a different way of seeing C. Right. And sometimes you'll use this E minor as an indication that it's not going home, like in a tag, you know. So imagine we're going. So the fact that I've gone to the 3 chord there sort of delays when it resolves, so it feels like it's going to go on for longer. Now, there's 2 ways of seeing this even. So if I see this as an E minor, that's implying that the C sound is still major, because E minor over C gives us C major 9. But very often you'll hear this sound, E minor 7 flat 5. And what that's implying now is that our 1 chord has become bluesy, like a dominant sound. So if I go 1, 6, 2, 5, to an E half diminished, that's making this C sound like it's C7. So that's what that's doing. That's making our 1 chord sound like it's a C7 chord rather than a C major 7 chord. I hope that makes sense. Let me just check that we have stuff wrong. Okay, so they're not really substitutions at all. That's just a reinterpretation. So I'm going to show you this other sort of magic chord. Now, so if we play, this case we'll do 2-5-1. We're going to go D minor to G7. Okay, so G7, the 3rd and 7th, are an F, do that here. By moving it from the 3rd fret to the 9th fret, what happens is the 3rd and 7th flip over. So we have root, 7th and 3rd, and here we have root, 3rd and 7th. Okay. So that's kind of a magic chord. I think Danny Gatton calls it the magic two-note voicing or something like that, along those lines. Okay. So now I'm going to expand upon this. I'm going to put a bass note in, and that's G7. But then I'm also going to add the flat 5. That's a G7 flat 5. Okay, and that's the root, flat 7, the major 3rd, and there's the flat 5. Okay, but let me show you an inversion of that chord. It's the exact same shape, because it's a symmetrical. So like Django again. Yeah, it sounds like the kind of thing you hear Django play. It's a symmetrical shape. So what I've added there is I've added the flat 5 of root, flat 7, major 3rd, flat 5. Okay. And the flat 5 note is a D flat. And again here, there's our G7, there's our D flat. Okay. But I could see that chord from two perspectives. So what about if that were the 3rd and that were the 7? Not the other way around. So that would make it a D flat chord. And that's the flat 5 now. So this chord could be perceived from two different ways entirely, and they're both just as valid as one another. It's a G7, root, flat 7, major 3rd, flat 5. Or it's a D flat 7, and that's the root, and that's the 3rd, and that's the 7, and that's the flat 5. So it's all flipped. And likewise this chord. D7, flat 7, sorry, flat 5, root, 7, 3, flat 5. Or it's a G7, root, 3, 7, flat 5. There's a bit of enharmonic respelling required because things like, when it's G7, that's G, that's F, that's a B. But when we see this as a D flat chord, then that's not a B anymore. It's actually a C flat. And you might say, well, what about if it was a C sharp chord? Well, okay, it's a C sharp chord. Great, well, it's no longer a D flat then, is it? That's got to change. So no matter what you do, something's got to change. In fact, when you see this as a D flat chord, that becomes like an A double flat. But, I don't want to get too, for our intents and purposes, they're the same thing, even though enharmonically they might be spelled in different ways. Now, why is that important to us? Well, because tritone substitution might be something that you've heard. But in actual fact, it's not really substitution. Tritone substitution is like taking your Strat to be repaired or to be replaced, and they just respray it a different colour and pass it off as a different guitar. You go, hang on, I recognise this. This is something I've already got. It's just called something else. So when we go D minor, G7, C major, we can actually go D minor, D flat 7. And we think of that maybe it's a different thing, but in actual fact it's not. It's just an inversion of G7 with a flat 5. In fact, that's the voice note. So D minor, D flat 7 if you want to think of it that way, C major. So our 1, 6, 2, 5 could go C, A7, A flat 7, G7, or E minor, E flat 7 because it's the tritone of A, D, D flat, C. And these are the kind of things that Joe plays. To create all these different variations. So for him, 1, 6, 2, 5 could be E7 sharp 9, E flat 7 sharp 9, D7 sharp 9, D flat 7 sharp 9. So that's based around the idea that any of these dominant chords can be seen from two different points. So G7 could actually be D flat 7, and A7 could be E flat 7, and D7 could be, yeah, that's right. So tritone substitution is kind of like a bit of it's not really a substitution, but I can understand why we think of it in that way. It's just a reinterpretation of the same notes, where we just change the value of the notes, but the actual notes are the same. Now, what we can do, though, if we play along with the deception, is there's a kind of an interesting Wes Montgomery move that we can use. And that is, we do treat it like as if it's a completely new chord. And then we can do things with that chord that you would normally do with 5 chords. So, for example, if we go D minor, normally it would be G7, and then to C major. If we go D minor, D flat 7, and we treat it like a D flat 7, we can do things like put a 2 chord in front of the new 5. So I can go D minor, A flat minor, D flat, C. And that's something you hear a lot, Wes do a lot, you know. Makes sense? So that is kind of a substitution now. Yeah, so what we did there, we went D minor, and then I reinterpreted the G7 as a D flat 7, even though it's kind of the same thing. But I play along with the deception, and I put a 2 in front of it. I go A flat minor, D flat 7 to C. And you can play off those changes against just a regular 2-5-1. Okay, so these are kind of examples where we take a little step further. A common substitution where, again, you know, where we're going along with the deception is to do things like, you know, if I go C to A7 to D7 to G7, I can play the tritone away from each of those, but I can make them into major 7 chords. So I go C. Okay, now instead of going to A7, we play along with this, you know, A7 is E flat and so on. But we change it one step and we make it E flat, not E flat 7, but E flat major 7. You could argue it's going C major, C minor, but you know, that's what it is. It's C, and then we've got a tritone sub of A, and then we do the same thing for the D. Instead of D, we treat it like D and A flat 7 are the same thing, coming from the same source. But we then make that into a major 7. And then we do the same thing with our G. Our G becomes D flat. We make that into a major 7. Ladybird changes, yeah. So that's particularly nice if you have a consistent high note. Sorry. Instead of 1, 6, 2, that's 1, 6, 2, 5. So that's maybe a little step further away from our initial change. So with this in mind, we've got to be aware of where substitutions are not really substitutions. But then there are instances where they are, you know, maybe this is something we could look at next week. So if we take a 2-5-1 and I'm going to do something where it does really move now. So, for example, I'm going to just keep the 5th degree of C as my point of familiarity. So I could play a D minor, with a G7. Now instead of C, now I'm going to go. Now that's a substitution. So if my melody was, I'm expecting it to go. So I might choose to go. So that's gone someplace else now. So if you played C major against that, you know, that would really jar. Now you could also argue that's related to C minor. If you look for connections, you'll find them, you know. But in that instance, this is where, like, a true substitution is when the harmony shifts. It's more like a reharmonization, I guess. But I'm aware of the fact that, you know, that's the expression that's in common usage. So we have to be a little bit careful about what we actually mean. Now, the reason why I'm stressing this point is, you might think, well, what happens if the bass player happens to drop a D flat note in and I don't know he's going to do it? He just does it sort of as part of a line or what have you. And I'm thinking of it as G. And because they're actually the same thing, it won't make a blind bit of difference. It's going to work fine. Likewise, if you're playing 1, 6, 2, 5 and the bass player plays 3, 6, 2, 5, that's going to be fine also. That's not going to upset the harmony. It's going to work perfectly. In fact, in some instances, sometimes when players are seeing these things as two different ideas, it can sound quite cool. I would be aware of the fact, though, if I'm listening for a 1, 6, 2, 5, and you hear that being expressed as a half diminished chord, that's an opportunity to get bluesy. Major. Hear that? Making sense? So even things like this. Or kind of red garland. Those kind of endings that you often hear. Those type of things. You might think, oh, that's a kind of massive substitution. But that's kind of seeing the 1 chord as Lydian. That's what that is. And then that's 4 minor. And then inversion. The 3 for the 1 sound. And then a bunch of tritone. 2. 5. 1. So I'm hoping this makes sense. So that might serve as a useful introduction to some ways of perceiving substitutions. So I know I haven't given you lots of different chord voicings. I'd say your homework here, for want of a better word, is to check out that Joe Pass video. It's absolutely amazing, and he'll give you loads of examples of where the chord voicings, where the notes in the voicings don't really change, but the bass notes change. I'll give you one, right, just so that you've got a specific thing to play, right? So I'm going to play this. I'm going to go 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, but I'm going to use the same voicing. E7, raise 9, A13. See, it's the same chord as this. D7 sharp 9. So this is trademark copyright Joe Pass, G7. Got it, yeah. So 1, 6, 2, 5. Effectively, that's what that is. But he could go tritone sub of the 5, 2 tritone sub of the 6. Forgive me. 2 tritone sub of the 5. Just wants to sort of cleanse the palate. There's an alternative there. That's the tritone of E, B flat. A flat is the tritone of D, G. So 1, 6, 2, 5 could be. Or any variation, That's why bass lines do this all the time. Because this could be this, and this could be this, and this could be this, and this could be. Making sense? Et voila. So, get hold of that Joe Pass video. It's brilliant. You won't regret it. You'll thank me for it in the long run. So, yeah, hopefully that's going to give you something to work on. Of course, by no means is this an exhaustive look at chord substitution. That's beyond the remit of one session, but we can keep coming back at this. If this interests you, please leave some comments. Let me know where we can go with this if you want me to go further, and I'll revisit this in the next week or so. The next 2 sections are going to be a little bit more pointed. It's going to give you some really specific things to play. And this one is the first of 2. It's based on a question that I got from Jordan around, how can chord melody things be less sort of blocky, rather crude shapes, sort of moving from one to another. And I suppose in a way I slightly touched upon it there with that Joe Pass thing, where he tries to find connections between the voicings, So where each voicing sort of leads on to the next one. So there might be a note in common, you know, whether it be, and then the next one could be, you know, so we've got like, or there could be notes that move in certain directions or opposing directions or so on. But what I'm going to do, instead of like just giving you sort of principles, I'm going to give you a very specific thing to practice here. So it's all going to be based on a simple 12-bar melody. And I've got 10 different variations. So we'll maybe look at the first 5 today. I'm just going to play them for you. And I'd like you to maybe try and learn them as close to the original as possible. This is more to do with, I guess, arranging. So the players that Jordan mentions in his email are guys like, you know, Martin Taylor, Ted Green, and you know, players like Lenny Breau and so on. And they would often sort of go between things that were improvised and things that are sort of arranged. So I think the way into this is to start by arranging stuff. So what I've done, I've put together a very simple melody. So this is just a kind of a blues melody. So imagine we've got the melody being 1, 2. So that's thing number 1, is learn that melody. 1, 2. So everything's going to be based around that melody. That's where it starts. It starts with that melody. So I'm going to look at some simple ways of expanding that melody. So thing number 1 is learn the melody. And it's based around the blues, you know. Whatever chords you could use. So the first thing I'm going to do to expand upon the melody is consider addressing it with octaves or fleshed out octaves, so octaves that are filled in. Kind of reminiscent of what Wes or George Benson might play. So instead of it being, we could go to the 4, 1, 2. That. So what I'm doing here, I'm either using pure octaves. So there's pure octaves. Then fleshed out with a 5th. And then maybe a raised 5 to fit the harmony. Flat 5. Or 4th to fit the harmony, whichever one you think suits. And then a 5. So that's thing number 1, octaves. 2, 3, 4. 5th. Flat 5. 4ths. 2, 3, 4. 5ths. When I say 5ths, I mean 5th and octaves. So we end up with 3 no voicings there. So that's all 3. So check out Benson's playing on Breezing, and you'll hear a lot of that stuff going on. So that might be the first thing we can do to approach arranging that melody. Instead of playing a single note, play it in octaves. Kind of simple, but effective. Okay, so that's thing number 1, and then thing number 2. So the first thing is the melody. Second thing is octaves. Okay, the third one I'm going to do is I'm going to harmonize the melody using appropriate 6ths or 10ths. And that might sound something like this. So I'm going to do this really slow. 1, 2. Make sense, yeah? It's a 10th there. So contrary motion things there, it's kind of interesting. So what you've got is a counter line now. The E flat. Now I'll go to tenths. The reason why I changed there to follow the underlying G7 harmony. Okay, so that's another step. So we've gone from another way of harmonizing that melody. Of course, this is just an example melody. Rather than taking a standard or whatever, you know, of course you can do it with a standard, but I'm just using this melody as a teaching device, really. Okay, so the next thing might be rather reminiscent of the way someone like Lenny Breau might play thirds and sevenths. So underneath that, he might go. Make sense? In this instance, we can do things like do that one more time. This is a full chord. So what I'm trying to do here is play the melody, but keep these thirds and sevenths. Now in this instance, I changed the finger in so that I can play the thirds and sevenths here. G7. Okay, so to recap, we got the melody, thing one. So this next one was octaves. The fifths, flat five. So then thirds, sixths and tenths. Chords, little chords by that I mean third and seventh chords, not full block chords. We'll get to that next week. Make sense there? And the final one for this week is going to be just simple half note bass lines. So in this case, it's going to go. Like so, yeah. Easier finger style. So the idea being this is keeping a min and pulse going. That's making sense? So that's 5 different approaches for playing the same melody with different chord melody options underneath. Now we're going to develop this next time, and we'll add like a walking bass. So instead of it being a half note bass line, it's going to be, the bass line's going to be moving on every beat whilst the melody maintains. We're going to add block chord voicings. We're going to play some things with quartal harmony. We're going to work on the idea of harmonizing every note with a different chord. And then as opposed to using just block chords to harmonize the what we might consider to be the important notes. So for this week, see how you get on with these 5, and we'll take it further as we go. As I say, the melody is just something that I wanted to just throw out there. It's just almost kind of like a throwaway sort of non-copyright thing, just to demonstrate the principles. Of course, you can do this with any tune, and maybe if you've got these ideas down, then start doing it with a different melody. Take the principle of, okay, play it in octaves and fifths, play it with thirds and sixths underneath, play it with a half note bass line, play it with, what else did I do? Oh, in fact, that was it. Yeah, that was what we did this week. So take each of those, like the melody and then the 4 ways of reharmonizing it, and try it with a standard or try it with a tune of your own. Whatever, they're just ideas. So that's this section. So we'll come back to this next week. So make certain that you've got the melody down and you've at least had a little go at these, and we'll take them further when we look at this again. Let's round things off with a lick that you can apply to your playing, but you can visit this on different levels, really. You could just learn it as it is, or you could look at why it works and then reinterpret it to your own, to your own preferences, your own tastes, and use it in your own vocabulary. Ties in with a question from Jack last week about how do you develop vocabulary, and one of the ways that I do it is by transcribing. So I heard Biréli play this. It's from Biréli Lagrène, amazing guitar player, and he plays over an E7. He plays this. And that's what I call sometimes, I've got a name for this, I call it familiar things in unfamiliar places. So when I transcribe that, like, well, that's a nice sound against an E7, kind of similar to, which is one that I've heard Biréli play, but I've also heard Joe Pass play. So indicates to me that Biréli's got the Virtuoso albums by Joe Pass, and at some stage he's gone in and figured that out. Either that's a remarkable coincidence that it's exactly the same phrase. But the first one, anyway, is over an E7 altered, and the voicing, maybe this might be nice to get down. It's a common voicing. It goes root, major third, flat 7, raised 9, sharp 5, root. So it's kind of unusual in the fact that the tonic's on the top. So in this key you can play a low E, but if you're in a different key, say you're in A, the tonic's actually the highest note. And the phrase is based on an descending arpeggio that's coming from that sound, and that's an F minor 6 against an E. So that's why I call it a familiar thing. So that's a familiar thing, F minor 6. But used in a kind of an unfamiliar place. It's used a semitone above a dominant chord. And the reason for this is if you look at the chord, so there's, for example, an F minor 6 with the 6 in the bass. Against D, when you position those two things together, what you get is a dominant 7 chord with a raised 5 and a flat 9, an altered dominant. So the minor 6th arpeggio, or yeah, in this particular instance in the key of F, the minor 6th arpeggio in any key, but a semitone above the root of a dominant chord is going to give you that altered sound. And the reason, of course, is minor 6th is related to melodic minor scale. In fact, if you remember back a few weeks ago, we looked at pentatonic scales that you can get from each degree of a melodic minor scale, and what can you get off the first degree? A minor 6 pentatonic. So you could play. So the only kind of thing that Biréli does that's slightly different to this is at the very start, he puts the E notes in, so it's like a major 7. He's It's got a variation that he uses as well, kind of Joe Pass. It's on the Virtuoso albums, if I'm not mistaken. So that suggests that when you're playing over an altered dominant chord, you can play minor sixth arpeggio semitone above the root. Now that's kind of interesting if you were to play a tune like Minor Swing. So this is where we talk about like being able to develop these ideas. So if I'm playing A minor, what can you play over A minor? Well, you guessed it, A minor 6. But then as A minor moves to D minor, going back to the thing about chord substitution, A minor could become A7 going to D minor. Yeah. That's what it could become. So I could be going A minor, A7, D minor. And A7 could become A7 altered, like the E7 could become E7 altered. And then which melodic minor would I choose, or which minor 6 would I choose? Well, the one semitone above. So A minor 6, B flat minor to D minor. So that's a common move you find in modern gypsy jazz. I think you'd even hear Django doing that, but you definitely hear Biréli doing that a lot. Just that sidestep of a semitone. So against a tune like Minor Swing, you've got at least four options for this minor sixth arpeggio. You can play A minor 6 against A, and then you can play B flat over A7, and then D minor 6, and then E7. So let me just play that for you one more time, real slow, so that you can get it down. So. And I'm hoping that's going to open the door to the minor 6 sound, but being used in different locations. Now, if you look at that arpeggio, you'll see that it shares all of the notes with a minor 7 flat 5. So by that what I mean is F minor 6 is D minor 7 flat 5. It's the same chord. And that can also be used against B flat 9. The thing I said again with the chords earlier, where I said the half diminished chord is really kind of dominant chord in disguise. So you'll find instances where this idea could be used against all of those type of chords. So really explore the sixth sound. It's a real big deal. But that, just for this week, that's our phrase. And then that's going to resolve to A minor or some kind of A thing, you know. Thanks once again. We're up to week 15. Wow. So yeah, please leave comments, likes. It's really helpful. Keeps this thing going. Spread the word if you can. If you enjoy it, if you don't mind, if you can share it, that would be really helpful. These things, they really do help. But the most important thing is keep the questions coming. The topics, they should be generated by you guys. So anything that you think that I could help with, or even just a suggestion of something that you think might be cool, I'm all ears. I'll aim and try to include, anything that's plausible and would seem to be useful. There's no sort of areas that are out of bounds in terms of music and guitar related stuff. If of course it's something that is of interest and it's something that I feel like I could maybe shed some insight onto, I'm more than happy to go there. So please keep the questions coming. I hope you enjoy the day. It's looking quite sunny outside. Once again, apologies for this not being live, but this thing came in this week. It's great that the wheels are slowly beginning to turn. There are some gigs happening, and there's some. We've got to be resourceful and industrious. Sorry, that doesn't even exist as a word. In terms of trying to find other ways to get our music out there. In fact, an album that I was part of was released yesterday from the London Gypsy Jazz collective, which is called Festival 2020, which is designed, to generate some income for some of these venues that are really struggling. Some of them are going under, it seems. So there, and that was something that's recorded in lockdown remotely. I've spoken about that in the past, but that seems to be a way to go, to keep us busy as musicians. So I hope you're finding a way to keep yourself motivated, and in some small part, I might be able to help in that. Keep the suggestions coming. I'll see you next week. Take care, and do lots of practice.